gradient flowing from left to right, from less dense to more dense. So just as that finishes, you'll notice before when I was saying that we need to gamma correct the texture so that it displays a little bit more correctly. And because this is a three-dimensional volume, it's not behaving in the exact same way as the texture itself. So that's why we always need to go a bit further down when we gamma adjust, just to make things smooth and transition off a little bit nicer. So if I go down here, and the reason I'm previewing this now is because once I change the orientation of this gradient, we won't have a preview for it. So I'm just going to do another re-render here, and now you can see making that adjustment has had a significant change on the look of the fog. Yet once again, if we go into the environment slot, let me just close this. At the moment, the fog distance is 10 centimeters. If I reduce that, we're going to see more of the fog start to show up again. So there you go. It's not as much as I predicted, but at the end of the day, the denser we make this, the more particles come through. So I'm just going to put this back to 10. Just going to reduce the step size. So now you can see here, see these little steps inside the system? That's the actual step size itself. So actually, let me go back. I'll make this one, and I'll show you how that's affecting your scene. So I don't know if you can see it here, but there's a bunch of kind of horizontal lines running through the surface. And if you start to notice those, just decrease the step size. So if I cancel this render and go up to 12 on the step size, when I render again, I'll be able to see those lines. And they're quite ugly. But go as high as you can on the step size until you do notice them causing issues, and then slowly drop it until they're gone. So I'm going to put the fog distance back to 10, and now we're going to go into the gradient, and we're going to change the angle so that it's vertical. And to do that, we adjust the y-axis, and if I rotate that 90 degrees and render again, you'll see from the top down, we are rendering the clouds. So down here in the white is the top, and the black is the bottom. I've always found though that it's a little bit easier to manage when you do it the opposite way, so that the right hand side is the base and the left is the top. So now, like I was saying, we've got a gradient determining where the clouds are in the system. So if I want to make the clouds higher up, all I need to do is add a couple of points here. And darken off these to black. So now the clouds should be further up in the system. And there you go, there they are. If I wanted to make layers of clouds, I could just use the same thing here. Go a bit further down. And now you'll see two layers of that box showing up. So before we go any further, this scene itself is really small. It's not to real world scale. And if you're an architectural company working on shots, you're going to need it to be real world scale. I've kept it small for these starting scenes just because it's a little bit easier to wrap your head around the numbers, and just in general it's just less information to deal with, less scene size, and overall, if you're working on a small scene from kind of 1 to 10 meters, you don't have to change the decimal units in max. But now we're going to go up in scale, and when we do that, we need to go to customize, and we need to change the units rollout, not the system unit setup. We want to keep those the same, but we want to go into the display units and set it to meters. So now when we go out, I'm just going to delete this ground plane and I'm going to put in a V-Ray ground plane so that we have a ground plane going all the way to the horizon, and you can see that's at 0. So I'm just going to create a quick V-Ray material for that. And now we can make our box a little bit more real world scale. And now when we do that, we're also going to have to adjust all the distances. So I'm going to make the distance 10 meters because we've gone from kind of 10 centimeters to 10 meters, just the same way we've gone from 200 centimeters to 200 meters. The step size I want to bring back up to 10. And sorry, let me just grab that ground plane. I'm going to go back to my compact material editor where I'd already made a material for that floor, and I'm just going to assign that. I always feel so cluttered when I've got to do everything on one screen. But so once again, I've recommended it to the Mastering Hard Surface guys, but if you can, get a couple of screens so that you don't have all this clutter. So now we've got our larger scale scene rendering, and we've still got our clouds here, and it's the same old. I'm just going to cancel that as you know what's going on. And I'm going to delete some of these points. So now where we've got the clouds before, I'm going to map a texture to this. So I'm going to go into the slate editor again, and you can see here in this gradient we've got a whole bunch of textures, and every time we add a new point it adds a new slot to apply a texture to that. So for this particular slot it's flag number 4. I'm just going to call this clouds. Now I know here where the clouds are, and I'm going to drag out a Burcon texture, a Burcon noise map. I'm going to set the size to 200 as a starting point, and just kind of up the low amount and decrease the high amount so that we create more contrast in that map. Let me just drag that up so you can see it. And the goal is that we've got a vertical texture driving where the clouds are. Now we've got a procedural 3D texture driving what the clouds look like at that point in the gradient. So this is a starting point for our cloud system. If I go from underneath and render, before I do that, I probably want to make the clouds a little bit higher on the top instead of, sorry, what I mean is they should be a little bit more flat on the base and then fade out and be a bit more rounded at the top. So if we go to the gradient ramp to simulate that, we can move that cloud texture to the right more and drag this a bit to the left. And now we're going to create more of a kind of fade, and the clouds should be a little bit taller and a little bit flatter at the base. Just cancel that and find a little bit better view. So it's not obvious enough yet to tell that's happening. So let's go into the gradient in the color correction and just decrease off a little bit of that contrast so that we can see more of the map being visible. So now the clouds are a bit softer at the top and a bit more dense down at the bottom. So the next thing to note is that when you apply textures to your surface, when you apply textures to your volume, you need to lower the fog distance because it becomes a little bit too soft. When you don't have any texture, this number behaves completely differently. So whenever I'm using a texture, I always like to lower the fog distance almost as much as possible and then control the thickness with the Burcon texture itself. So I'm going to go to 0.01 here and maybe just find a little bit of a better angle and render again. Now the clouds are going to be much more dense. And when we make them more dense, we need to go back into the gradient texture and drop that down. So now we still get the same fade off happening, but the clouds have an overall more dense feel to them. So let's go to the gradient and let's just drop the height of those. And I'm just going to move that a little bit to the left. It is quite fidgety, and like I was saying at the start of the lesson, it is hard to control the surface itself. But now that we've got a kind of rough idea of the scale of the Burcon, we can start to control the map itself. So let's just drop, I'm just going to drop off on the on the low intensity, sorry. And on the high, I'm just going to soften that a little bit more. Also, I'm going to introduce some noise, and you can start with kind of whatever you want. Right here, I've got a fractal noise texture. And I'm just going to go up a little bit on size. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to increase the levels of detail in the fractal itself. I don't know if you remember in lesson 4, I was saying that when you add a whole nother level to this, say when you go from 3 to 4, it completely duplicates this entire Burcon texture, halves the size and halves the opacity. So I go up to 4 here, more detail is being added in. And I can just play with a couple of different ones if I want. So I'm going to use turbulence and we'll see how that looks. And I'm just going to go from above. And I can cancel that because I can see the clouds themselves are too small. I'm going to make that 1000. So the overall shape of the clouds is quite nice now. And I'm just going to, rather than rendering from above, I'm just going to go from below and see how that looks with the sun scattering through them. So the clouds start to have a little bit more of a natural feel to them, but at the same time we've got all this crazy noise running through the surface that we need to get rid of. So you'll remember before I was talking about the step size, and now that we've gone so low on the fog distance, our step size is a little bit too high. So as we begin to lower that, we're going to get more detail coming through the surface and we're going to start to get rid of this noise. So even before we go in and add AA, we can clean up the clouds quite a lot. So I'm going to reduce the step size to 2 meters and just do a region render to see how that's affecting things. And now they'll become a lot more voluminous and you'll be able to see more of how solid they actually are. But one issue that I'm noticing while rendering these clouds is that we're using a not very detailed procedural texture, and there's better alternatives. So I'm just going to cancel this, and I'm going to drop the step size down to 1 just so we get a little bit more detail. Now I'm going to go into the texture surface itself and just play with a couple of different ones. So we'll see what FBM looks like. And the clouds should look a little bit more realistic and a little bit more detailed. But now that we've decreased that step size, we are increasing the amount of calculations V-Ray has to do, so the render time goes up quite a bit. And it's at this point where you start to realize that the environment fog, when you do use it with high-res textures, isn't that quick, and you will have to wait a long time. But with that being said, whenever I've tested Vue or things like that, the render times are also massive. Anytime you're dealing with kind of volumetric data, there's huge amounts of it. So there's kind of no way for, at the moment anyway, for V-Ray to speed this stuff up. But I have heard rumors that in the next kind of major update of V-Ray, there will be some kind of speed improvements for volumetric surfaces, but that's just a rumor. But all we can do is kind of hope that in the future, this type of task is sped up greatly. So I've cancelled the render because it's still quite noisy. And what I've realized is, while working with environment fog, is that when you don't have any textures mapped to the surface, you don't need to use anything else but the fog subdiv value to clean the fog up. So when you don't have any texture map, you just raise that to say 32 like I had at the start of the lesson, or 16, and it'll go away. That's just because it's uniformly distributed and it's very easy to clean the surface when you don't have textures. The reason why, as soon as you add a kind of high frequency noise texture like the Burcon, is that you're introducing a lot of areas into the surface that kind of cause colored noise, like difference between one pixel and the next. So it's at that point where you kind of need to start to look at it a little bit differently, and that's why I've got the subdiv value much lower now, but I'm going to go into the anti-aliasing settings and drop that down. You can see I've got the color threshold set to 1, so there's no AA in the scene at the moment. But if I go down to 0.03 as the starting point and re-render, because we've got all these edges and things needing AA, that's going to give the clouds its final kind of smooth push. And then I'll show you in Photoshop how you can use its noise reduction tools just to get rid of that last little bit of noise that's in the render. So I'll do one more render with a bit of anti-aliasing now, and at that point I can go in and show you how to add the fog underneath the volume so we can get some rays scattering through. And it's at that point where it's kind of, you've kind of know everything you can do with environment fog. I'm going to go in and show you a few example scenes afterwards that I set up for you guys, just to show you what's capable in the fog system. But as you can see here, when I do increase that AA to clean up the fog, that final last little bit, the render time does go up quite a bit once again. So you're just going to need to deal with the render times if you want to do this type of work, and all we can do is hope for speed improvements in the future. So I've decided I'm just going to cancel this render and do one more, and the reason for that is because at the moment we've got the ground casting a lot of GI into the clouds. You can see here that this green color is coming straight from the ground. So to fake that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the shader of the ground. I'm just going to get rid of the reflection just to speed things up a little bit, and I'm going to get rid of all that saturation in the scene so that when we do render the clouds, they do have a kind of nice white glow bouncing back up into them. So if I zoom in, you can see that there's just still a little bit of noise left in the cloud surface. So to get rid of that, I found the best solution is, rather than increase the subdivs in V-Ray and increase the render time tons, is just to save it out and load it up into Photoshop. So I'll bring it in Photoshop, and then we can just use the noise reduction tools there that have been added to Photoshop CC that do a really good job of cleaning this stuff up. So to get rid of this noise, all you need to do is I've loaded up the EXR file. I'm just going to make that 8-bit, set it to exposure and gamma so it doesn't change anything. And now you can see if I make it full screen, I'm just going to use the filter noise reduce noise tool. And this has just recently been added in Photoshop CC. So you can see here that if I do the before and after, you can see there's a lot of noise in the surface. And if you find just the right settings, you can pretty much get rid of all that noise without losing any detail. And I'll just do a kind of before and after there and zoom in. And you can see the before and after. You're just cleaning up that last little bit, which saves a ton of time. So now at this point, because I've shown you how to get the clouds in themselves, we don't have any God rays at the moment. And you can see I've got a couple of example renders here that I was posting to Facebook and I'll share these scene files with you because they are set up very similar to the one I've just set up with you now, just with varied lighting. I'll go through and just do a quick run through of those scene files for you. But basically we need to add the environment fog below the clouds now, and that was always difficult for people to get working because you can only have one V-Ray environment fog system. You can't have the clouds and then create an entirely different. It'd be nice if you could, but unfortunately you can't. So the solution involves going into the gradient that makes up the environment fog. Let me just bring up the material editor, and introducing some color values near the base of the clouds. So if you remember from kind of left to right here, we've got the clouds fading up, and I'm just going to soften the base of those clouds off a little bit. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the gamma value. Because we've got such contrasty clouds at the moment, I'm just going to soften off the gamma a little bit so that the clouds are a little bit more solid. And then the gradient down the base here, I'm just going to introduce a kind of value that's a kind of low gray value. So when we go to render the clouds, you'll see now that this base area is kind of a solid, because we don't have any textures mapped to that, the only textures at this certain cloud height. So we're just going to get a thick fog running through the base, and it does render quickly, but I'll just change the camera angle here and let a render go off so you can see that effect coming through. So I don't know if you remember, but in the ice lesson I was saying that when you kind of push V-Ray to its limit, you sometimes run into situations where these last buckets hang, and that's happened here again. But as you can see, if I go to the atmosphere tab, because we've got that gradient down the bottom now, the shadows are being cast through there, and you do end up with those God Ray-like effects. So in terms of what you can learn from the lesson, this is pretty much what you're capable of doing with V-Ray. However, let me just cancel this render and jump back into Photoshop, and you can see quite a lot of testing went into making this lesson. However, they're all pretty similar scenes. I'm just going to quickly run through what I've done to create a couple of these effects. So you can see here in this scene, what I've done is I'm just going to load that up. I've got a orange spherical V-Ray light kind of right above the clouds, just so we get some angle on the lights, as well as angle on the light rays, as well as getting that nice glow coming through the clouds, because we do have such a high intensity light like the sun. In order to do that, I've had to darken off the environment a little bit and just tweak that a bit, because the GI from the clouds and the shadow will come from the HDR or whatever you have in the environment. So you can see here in this scene, in the shadows, it's very quite blue. So in order to do that, I had to load a very blue HDR. So let me just load up the scene and I'll just run you through it. So like I was saying, in this scene, it's the exact same setup as what I've shown you in the lesson. However, above the clouds, we've just got a really small and powerful V-Ray light with a bit of color in it. And then for the sky, rather than using a dome light, I've used an output map with a V-Ray, like a sky environment plugged into that. So let me just go into the material editor. And the reason I've done that is because when you use a V-Ray sky in the environment slot without using a V-Ray sun, it's going to be overly bright because V-Ray expects you to use exposure control with your camera. But because I turn that off, what I do is I put an output into the sky and then drop the output amount down. So you can see if I leave it at 1, it's way overblown. So that's just a cool little trick to do when you want a quick blue sky, but you don't want to use exposure control with the camera. So the last image I want to show you how I created is this kind of weird alien sci-fi like cloudscape, and I created that using a composite Burcon texture with a modified smoke map. So it got a little bit complex with experimenting with different types of Burcon textures to use. But also what's important in this scene is that we've got parts of the clouds that are kind of coming up and sticking out. So let me just go into Max, and you can see to do that, rather than using just this plain old square for the volume, I started out with a square, subdivided it, and then started extruding out kind of puffs. One of the issues doing this is that when you contain the volume in something so like low detail, you might end up with areas in the fog that clip with the edges of the texture. And let me just load up Photoshop, and you can kind of see that happening here. So there is one way you can avoid that, and that's by going into the environment fog. And you'll see down here, if you click this gizmo, there's a per gizmo fade out. And all that does is it just fades the fog from the edge of the container. But when you do that, once again, you're just adding more processing time, and things just slow down tons. So this render itself at 1920 by 1080 was overnight. I just let it kind of go one night, and it took about 7 hours, but it produced some really cool results. So if I go into the material editor here and drag out that density map that's in the fog, you can see I've got a composite set up, and I've got 2 layers. So let me just hide the base layer, and you can see in the smoke here I've got this really cool procedural smoke happening. So if I turn off the output map, you can see I've darkened that off with its own output. But if I go into the smoke itself, I've created a really bizarre kind of curve which adjusts how the fog looks. So if I take that off, that's just a standard smoke material, and it's what you could use to create clouds if you wanted to. But if I enable that adjustment, I've gone in and just created a whole bunch of random variation. The issue is that because the fog system needs to be so detailed, you need to really clamp down on those colors. So that's why I go from here to there and darken those off. And then when I introduce a soft light version of a Burcon noise map over the top, it just gives me a little bit more realistic cloud detail plugging through. Because when I turned this off, it just looked it didn't look very organic. It kind of just looked like a bunch of ridges inside the clouds. So as soon as I enabled a little bit more realism through that, I ended up with these really cool tendrils that just looked like winds kind of blowing the surface. So kind of to sum up the lesson, the environment fog system is really powerful, but you are quite limited to what you can do with it. But like I was saying at the very start of the lesson, if you're patient enough, you can produce some really, really cool results. And if your entire image needed to be a cloud system like this, you might be able to go in and add buildings. And I had a couple of suggestions and things like that on how to improve it. But overall, you can see that you can do pretty much everything. Down here, I've got a kind of dry ice look on the ground, and that's just using a very similar gradient, but instead of the gradient being up the top, I've just shifted that down to the bottom and kind of inverted it. So feel free to plug different types of Burcon textures through. I think it'd be really cool to see some of the results you guys get from doing this. But other than that, you're just going to have to deal with the long render times. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I will be providing the scene files for all these things you've seen here. It might take me a day to put that together tomorrow. But I hope you really enjoyed the lesson, and I will see you later. Thank you.